Hey there, guys. All right, today we're starting the real home stretch here, I feel. Great War Week 220. The Hindenburg line breaks. Apparently, they don't know spoiler alerts here on the Great War channel. God damn, come on. That's a fucking massive spoiler, dude. Next thing you're gonna tell me Germany loses. You're gonna tell me that the Treaty of Versailles is an overly harsh punishment upon the German people and doesn't actually punish the people truly responsible for the outbreak of and continuation of World War One. Surely this has a happy ending. Surely. And the Lost Battalion returns. I don't know what that reference is. Anyways, my voice might be a little rough right now because I talked a lot last night. When hanging with my friends, I talked a lot. So might be a little rough. But I got some water near me. Maybe we'll be fine. Let's dive in.
Two of the Central Powers fronts have collapsed. One Central Power has left the war, and the German Chancellor has asked the Allies for an armistice. This week, that request is rejected, even as the Allies overrun the Hindenburg line of defense.
Dun dun dun.
I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week, Bulgaria accepted Allied terms for peace and left the war. There are now only three Central Powers. The Allied breakthrough on the Palestine front continued with the fall of Damascus. There were four simultaneous Allied offensives in progress on the Western Front, and new German Chancellor Prince Maximilian von Baden asked the Allies for an armistice. Now, that request was not a surrender by any means, and was really a try to end the war with no harmful conditions for Germany or Austria. That was Max's goal. So he claims that he's open to Woodrow Wilson's 14 points for peace, which we've talked about before and which are in the description. On the 5th, Max says he's open to a League of Nations, to the idea of restoring Belgian independence, and is for the Reichstag resolution of July 19, 1917. That was passed last year by the Reichstag, but ignored by German High Command, and sought a peace with no annexations, no indemnities, freedom of the seas, and international arbitration by a body such as a League of Nations. Max also says civilians would have authority in all civilian matters. The next day, though, a letter that he wrote to a Swiss prince is made public. In it, he...
Swiss prince? What? That's a... Huh? Huh? Switzerland. What? They have princes? In the 20th century? Huh. That's a new one.
He jeers at Western democracy and calls that July peace resolution a disgusting child born of fear and the Berlin Dog Days. The whole letter is in fact a diatribe against allowing the German people a voice in government. On the 7th, German industrialist Walter Rathenau wrote a call for a final, huge military effort in Vossische Zeitung, a major national newspaper. This was not to win the war, but to get the strongest possible negotiating position, one of equality rather than defeat. But he didn't just encourage men to sign up. He wrote of all the armies of occupation and security in the vast eastern regions Germany had gained earlier this year, pointing out that only half of all the troops were actually on the Western Front. German Quartermaster General Erich Ludendorff thought that combing out all those troops would be more trouble than the army could stand. But Rathenau wasn't finished. He wrote to the Minister of War that if Germany evacuated Belgium and Alsace-Lorraine, it would end German capacity for defense in future, and they would always be at the West's mercy. Well, whatever anyone else was thinking, Woodrow Wilson rejected Max's proposal the 8th. The first condition of any armistice was the evacuation of...
I feel like one thing that they're forgetting to do here is they're not doing, in my eyes, a good job. Like, why is the U.S. um kind of being seen as the like why is Germany going to the U.S. for an armistice here? Um, because I mean, yeah, we know the English and French. I think by this time probably have made it pretty clear that we're gonna keep going. But like, what? I feel like the U.S. and Woodrow Wilson don't really have the leverage to get the French and English to even agree to a armistice with Germany. With like, because the U.S. just joined, like their troops just arrived in force this year. Uh, and while they have been extremely helpful in the period of time that the U.S. has been involved, um, they still haven't been around for the whole war. That's something that that affects the outcome of the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles, it ends up being the way it is largely because the French and British did not want to listen to the U.S. because the U.S. wasn't involved in the war from the beginning, and like that's a reasonable, it's an understandable um feeling that the British and French had. Still fucked up, but understandable. It's like I don't understand why the how the U.S. has any sort of ability to really bring about peace here. Like World War II, if this were World War II now I would understand because that's with the U.S. gaining more and more importance in the world stage. At this point, no one, people don't think much of the U.S. at this point.
All occupied territories. So no more Germans in Belgium or all of that Eastern territory, no more Austrians in Serbia, and so forth. But it sure wasn't going to be easy to drive them out of Belgium or France. Autumn rain had come and slowed things, and of course, the German infrastructure was still formidable, particularly in the eastern part of France, where the Americans were attacking. And the Americans had a big problem, a serious shortage of horses. But when American Commander John Pershing asked Allied Supreme Commander Ferdinand Foch for 25,000 of them, he was told to get them from the States. But there wasn't shipping space available. Pershing estimated that he was 100,000 horses short. French General Philippe Pétain suggested solving the supply problems by dissolving the American First Army and having those divisions with supply problems assigned to the French armies. Pershing said no, though interestingly enough, 10 of the 30 American divisions fit for fighting were actually serving under British or French command. This was all kind of unfair anyway. Foch's changing of strategy in September and the speed of setting up the current offensive, one in a rural location, was partly to blame for all this. But the tensions in the Allied command that had ebbed and flowed all year flared up again. Henri Gouraud's French Fourth Army had been making better progress than the Americans in that offensive, and Foch's staff was disappointed with the Americans. And I said last week that French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau got stuck in a traffic jam behind the lines, right? Well, he was furious and told Foch not to try to persuade Pershing of anything, but to order him to do it. David Stevenson points out, the upshot was that the attempt to disorganize the Germans by attacking them from the south had failed, although it had been crucial to Haig's and Foch's conception of the offensive as a whole. It had done so, moreover, in circumstances that revived old tensions within the Western Alliance.
Uh-oh.
By October 6th, the American offensive had reached casualties of 75,000.
Dang.
They could not quickly replace their losses any longer. The lousy weather prevented any air support, and the acute horse shortage was really telling. Pershing now decided not to attack the central position, his goal, but would focus on the heights of the Argonne and the Meuse on the flanks. By the end of the week, the Argonne forest was, in fact, cleared of Germans, though it wasn't a big breakthrough. And yet, the Americans had slowly but surely battered their way to the Kriemhilde Stellung, the main German defense line. Also in the Argonne, on the 8th, an American conscientious objector, well, a former one on religious grounds, saw some action. Corporal Alvin York. He and his men were tasked with taking out a German machine gun position. When 9 of his 17 men were wounded or killed, he told the rest to guard the prisoners they'd already taken, and he went after the machine gun post himself. He killed as many as 28 men with insanely good marksmanship.
Yeah, that ain't no conscientious objector right there. That's a crack shot right there. God damn.
Picking them off their machine guns with his rifle, and then foiling a 6-man bayonet charge with his pistol. When the
This man real?
German officer running the post surrendered, York returned to the lines with 132 prisoners and 35 machine guns. He was promptly promoted to sergeant and became not just a national American hero, but an international celebrity.
What?
That same
Ow.
day, some other men also returned
Ow.
to the American lines. See, last week, an American force of over 500 men holding a ravine about half a mile ahead of the front lines were surrounded by a far larger German force. They were continuously fired upon by artillery for 2 days. Their food ran out. Then they were hit by friendly fire artillery. They sent their last carrier pigeon with the instructions for the Americans to please stop shelling the Americans. The Germans sent in flamethrower units. These were dealt with. American High Command thought it was all over for those men and listed them as lost. But the Germans withdrew the 7th, and the lost battalion was not, in fact, lost. The next day, the survivors, 194 of 554, returned to the American lines. And one more piece of American news. On October 10th, the news reported that 20,000 Americans had died in France in the past 2 months of the flu.
Uh-oh, I wonder what that could be.
As for the rest of the fighting on the Western Front this week, there was Allied success further west in the center of the front. The Beaurevoir Line, the last line of defense of the Hindenburg Line defense system, fell this week. After this, the Australia Corps was finally taken out of the lines for R&R. They were nearing the limits of exhaustion. The Germans fell back to the Sweep River. The Allies launched the Second Battle of Cateau, and this combined with the ongoing fighting for Cambrai resulted in an Allied advance on the 8th on the whole Saint-Quentin-Cambrai front. 10,000 prisoners and 150 guns were taken in 1 day. The French drove the Germans back on the Arne, Aisne, and Sweep rivers. On the 9th, the Canadians entered Cambrai, and the following day, when the Germans were forced back beyond the Oise Canal, the mighty Hindenburg Line had been totally overrun. Wow. So near the end of the week, the German army began a systematic retreat along the whole Western Front, even stripping the Flanders coast of ships and planes. But they were still fighting, and fighting hard, and the Allied advance was halted. The German retreat was by night from the 9th to the 11th to the still unfinished Hermann position. So when the British reached the new German defenses at the Selle River, which was flooded to boot, they were stopped because the Germans had brought up their heavy artillery and their reserves. So this would require another planned set-piece attack if it was to be broken. The Allies had 6 million men now in the West, but since their tank, aircraft, and artillery advantages were so great, and their combined attack doctrine widely adopted, they didn't actually need all of those men. They could wear the enemy down with heavy guns, planes, and tanks. The French now had 40% of their army in the artillery, and 20 times the big guns they'd had in 1914. Those Canadians that first broke the Hindenburg Line did so in part by firing close on to 1 million artillery rounds in 2 days. A World Undone says that by early October, 12,000 tons of munitions were being fired every day. The French 75s were firing 280,000 rounds a day. And yet, Allied combat deaths still, amazingly, exceeded German ones. The Germans just didn't have as many easily available replacements. They did, as Walter Rathenau pointed out, have huge amounts of troops in other regions, though. On the 5th, they were reported withdrawn from the Macedonian front. By the 10th, the Allies there were approaching Niš, which was held by none other than German Field Marshal August von Mackensen. As for the German Allies, you gotta realize that even though the Bulgarians had just left the war, Austrian troops were still fighting, but the Serbian and French forces were slowly advancing northwards to Belgrade and the Danube. The Allied advance continued on the Palestine front as well, occupying Beirut this week. Also this week, reports from the Ottoman Empire came out that Enver Pasha, Ottoman Minister of War for the entire duration of this war so far, and a main architect of it, of the Ottoman entry back into it in 1914, had been dismissed by the Sultan.
About goddamn time. Took him fucking long enough. Jesus. Oh. The sheer amount of incompetence that we have seen from 1914 onward is just astounding. Like I think one of the things when it comes to looking at history, like, you know, even in schools, even if you're not pursuing history, I mean, it's probably especially as you're, if you're not pursuing history, really kind of when you are pursuing it, you see it. The amount of incompetent people in charge of things, of countries, of armies. How? How? Like, oh my God.
And the week comes to an end. Allied advances taking ground in the west, but stalling because of new defenses or a lack of horses. Tales of heroism from the Argonne Forest, the breaking of the Macedonian and Palestine fronts continuing at speed, and German high command trying to figure out what concessions it is willing to make for an armistice to stop the slaughter in the field. But Wilson rejected Max's proposal this week, so that slaughter is going to continue. I don't think I can even begin to imagine the frustration of the high commands now that the victor in the war is pretty clear, but the fighting is heavier than ever. Sir Edward Grey, who had been the British foreign minister when the war began, had this to say this week, which are very sad words when you think of what it will actually entail. Peace is within sight, but not within reach. If you'd like to learn more about the
That's a damn good quote. Holy shit.
famous or infamous Hindenburg Line defense system, you can click right here for our special.
And that was the Great War Week 220. The Hindenburg Line breaks, and the lost battalion disappears and returns within the same week. Yeah, this was a decent episode. This was this was another one of the ones where things happening, but they're not really anything we can, and we haven't already talked about, or just don't have really anything to add to them outside of what Indy says in the video. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.